The boulder had pinned her like prey beneath a predator's jaw. But Haken still heard the whisper carried on the wind through the cascade pines. A sound so soft it might have been the forest itself breathing its last. He moved closer to the ravine's edge where the rockslide had carved a fresh wound into the mountainside, expecting to find a wounded deer or perhaps a bear cub separated from its mother. Instead, he found her, a woman with skin the color of rich earth, her body twisted beneath a slab of stone that had no mercy in its weight. Blood seeped from beneath the rock, darkening the soil around her like spilled ink. Her eyes, wide and glittering with pain and something darker, fear that had long ago turned to resignation, lifted to meet his. She did not cry out. She did not beg. Her cracked lips parted, and the words that emerged were steady as a blade drawn in moonlight. "End it fast, Hunter. I'll stay silent." The sentence hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. And Haken felt something crack open inside his chest, not from shock, but from the terrible recognition of what those words meant. What kind of life taught a person to ask for death as a mercy? Haken was Modoc, born beneath the shadow of Mount Shasta, where the sky met stone and the earth spoke in languages older than any treaty or boundary line. His people had been pushed westward by settlers hungry for land, their numbers thinned by disease and violence until only scattered bands remained. He had chosen solitude over surrender, retreating deep into the Cascade Wilderness where the Oregon Territory bled into Northern California, a place so remote that even the army patrols avoided its tangled ravines and ice-choked rivers. His shelter was a lean-to built against a cliff face, hidden by a curtain of Douglas fir and western red cedar, with a fire pit dug into the stone and a cache of dried venison hanging from the branches above. He lived by the old ways, hunting elk and black-tailed deer, trapping marten and beaver, trading pelts only when necessity drove him toward the scattered outposts, where white men gathered to drink and argue over land they did not own. He had learned to read the forest the way others read scripture. Every broken twig and shifted stone told a story, and lately, the stories had been troubling. Bootprints too heavy for trappers, the kind left by men who moved with purpose rather than patience. And the faint scent of fear, human fear, lingering near the creek beds where someone had tried to cover their tracks. The woman beneath the stone had stopped trying to free herself. Her hands lay flat against the earth now, palms up as though in surrender to whatever fate awaited her. Haken could see the tremor in her fingers, the way her chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. How long had she lain here, crushed beneath the unforgiving weight of stone and circumstance? The blood pooling around her leg suggested hours at least, maybe longer. The sun was already sinking behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust, and the temperature was dropping fast. Even if she survived the injury, the cold would take her before morning. He saw all of this in the span of a heartbeat, his mind calculating the way a hunter calculates wind direction and distance before releasing an arrow. When he knelt beside the woman now, the weight of her gaze pressed against him like a physical thing. She did not flinch as his shadow fell across her face, did not turn away when his hand hovered near the stone. Her breathing was shallow, each inhale a struggle against the crushing pressure on her ribs. Haken could see the way her fingers had clawed at the earth, nails torn and bloodied, the dirt beneath them packed hard from her desperate attempts to free herself. The fabric of her dress, once perhaps a pale gray or faded blue, was torn in multiple places, revealing scratches and bruises that spoke of a long and brutal journey through unforgiving terrain. Her feet were bare, the soles cut and swollen, wrapped hastily in strips of cloth that had long since soaked through with blood and mud. This was a woman who had been running hard and running long, from something terrible enough to drive her into these mountains without proper clothing or supplies. He spoke in English, the language he had learned from trappers and missionaries, though his own tongue felt more natural on his lips. "I am not here to harm you." Her eyes narrowed, suspicion flaring bright despite the pain. "Every man says that," she whispered, her voice hoarse and cracked. "Every man lies," Haken did not argue. Words were cheap, and she had no reason to trust them. He had seen enough of the world beyond his forest sanctuary to understand that trust was a currency few could afford. Especially a woman alone in the wilderness. Especially a woman whose skin marked her as property in the eyes of the men who made the laws. Instead, he moved to the boulder, testing its weight with both hands. The stone was massive, easily 300 pounds, wedged at an angle that made leverage difficult. He circled it slowly, studying the way it had fallen, the smaller rocks scattered around it like broken teeth. The rockslide had been recent, triggered perhaps by the heavy rains that had swept through the territory 2 days prior, loosening the soil and sending tons of earth and stone cascading down the mountainside. She had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, or perhaps fleeing in such desperation that she had not noticed the unstable ground beneath her feet. If he moved the stone wrong, the weight could shift and crush her completely. He would need to lift and roll simultaneously, using the natural slope of the ravine to guide it away from her body. He braced his feet against the loose gravel, boots digging in for purchase, and positioned his hands beneath the boulder's edge where the stone curved slightly, offering the barest suggestion of a grip. His breath came slow and deliberate, the way his father had taught him before a hunt, centering his strength in his core, letting his legs bear the burden rather than his back. Then he pulled, veins standing out along his forearms, shoulders burning with the strain. The boulder resisted, grinding against the earth with a sound like distant thunder, refusing to yield. Haken growled low in his throat, a sound more animal than human, and heaved again. Sweat broke out across his forehead, despite the cooling air. His muscles screamed in protest, but he did not relent. This time the stone shifted, just an inch, then 2, the smallest movement that nevertheless meant the difference between life and death. He adjusted his grip, planted his feet wider, and threw every ounce of strength he possessed into one final pull. The boulder rolled, slowly at first, then faster, tumbling away from her body and coming to rest several feet down the slope with a heavy thud that sent smaller rocks skittering in all directions. The woman gasped, a sharp inhale that turned into a moan as blood rushed back into her crushed leg. Her body convulsed involuntarily, back arching as sensation returned in a flood of agony. Haken moved quickly, dropping to his knees beside her, hands hovering over her leg but not touching, assessing the damage with practiced eyes. The bone was not protruding through the skin, which was a mercy, but the swelling was severe, and the bruising already spreading in dark purple and black patterns across her thigh and calf. She would not walk for days, possibly weeks. He slid his arms beneath her, one under her shoulders and one beneath her knees, lifting her as gently as the urgency allowed. She was lighter than he expected, her body worn thin by exhaustion and hunger, ribs visible beneath the torn fabric of her dress. But she did not go limp in his arms. Even now, injured and helpless, she held herself with a rigid tension, as though surrendering to his care would be a final defeat. A last humiliation she could not bear. Her head lolled against his chest as he carried her, and he felt the heat of her breath through the rough fabric of his buckskin shirt. She smelled of sweat and blood and something else, the acrid scent of fear that had soaked into her skin over days or weeks of running. He carried her up the ravine, boots finding purchase on the uneven ground, his pace steady despite the added weight. The forest closed around them, Douglas firs rising like ancient sentinels on either side, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the fading sunlight into scattered beams of gold. Shadows deepened as the sun dipped lower behind the mountain peaks, and the temperature continued its relentless drop. By the time he reached his shelter, twilight had painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and dying gold, and the first stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening expanse above. Inside the lean-to, the air was cool and smelled of cedar smoke and cured hides. Hakan laid her on a bed of fir boughs covered with a worn elk hide, the only softness his sparse existence afforded. The shelter was simple but functional, built with the careful attention of someone who understood that survival in the wilderness depended on preparation and respect for the elements. The walls were constructed from interwoven branches and packed with moss for insulation. The roof a careful arrangement of cedar bark that shed rain and snow with equal efficiency. Tools hung from wooden pegs driven into the support posts, a skinning knife, an awl for working leather, a hatchet with a handle worn smooth from years of use. A bow and quiver of arrows rested in the corner, the bow unstrung to preserve its flexibility. Dried herbs hung in bundles from the rafters, their fragrance mixing with the ever-present scent of wood smoke. She lay still on the elk hide, eyes tracking his every movement as he built up the fire, adding dry kindling until flames licked hungrily at the larger logs. Light filled the space, pushing back the encroaching dark, and for the first time, he could see the full extent of her injuries. Her leg was swollen, the skin mottled with deep bruises that spread from her thigh to her ankle. Blood had soaked through the torn fabric of her dress, a simple garment that had once been white or perhaps cream-colored, but was now stained with mud and gore, and the rust brown of dried blood. Scratches covered her arms, some shallow, others deep enough to weep fresh blood. Her hands were worst of all, palms raw and blistered, fingernails cracked and torn, the evidence of someone who had clawed their way through miles of unforgiving terrain. But it was her eyes that held him, dark and fathomless, filled with a weariness that went deeper than physical pain. A weariness born of suffering that had no end in sight. He fetched water from the creek, carrying it back in a hollowed gourd, and set it near the fire to warm. The creek ran year-round, fed by snowmelt from the higher elevations, its water cold and pure. From his supplies, he pulled strips of clean cloth, a bone needle, and a small pouch of yarrow root he had gathered in the summer meadows. The Modoc used it to staunch bleeding and fight infection, and though he was no healer, he had learned enough to keep himself alive through winters and injuries. His mother had taught him before the sickness took her, showing him which plants healed and which ones killed, which berries nourished and which ones poisoned. That knowledge had kept him alive when others had fallen, and now he would use it to keep this woman alive as well. When he returned to her side, she watched him with the same wary intensity, her jaw set as though bracing for more pain. He knelt beside her, dipping the cloth into the warm water, and began to clean the wounds on her arms. She hissed through her teeth but did not pull away. Her fingers curled into the elk hide, knuckles white, but she made no sound beyond that first sharp breath. He worked methodically, wiping away the dried blood and dirt to reveal the extent of the damage beneath. Most of the scratches were superficial, already beginning to scab over, but a few were deeper, requiring his attention. He crushed yarrow root between his fingers, mixing it with a small amount of water to form a paste, and applied it to the worst of the cuts. The plant's natural properties would help prevent infection and speed healing. "What is your name?" he asked quietly. His voice low enough not to startle, she hesitated, as though the question itself was a trap, as though giving him her name would grant him power over her. "Amara," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Amara Collins." Hakan nodded, acknowledging the offering without pressing for more. "I am Hakan Modoc," she said, and it was not a question. She had seen enough to recognize the signs. The buckskin clothing decorated with simple geometric patterns, the tools hanging from the shelter's frame, the way he moved through the forest as though it were an extension of his own body. He did not correct her, did not explain the complexities of tribe and territory, the way his people had been scattered and broken by forces neither understood nor controlled. Instead, he focused on her leg, using his knife to carefully cut away the ruined fabric of her dress to expose the damage beneath. The skin was split in two places, bone visible through the deeper gash, white and stark against the surrounding tissue. He worked methodically, cleaning the wounds with yarrow-steeped water. His hands steady despite the gravity of the injury when he began to stitch the torn flesh. Using sinew thread and the bone needle, Amara finally broke. A low, keening sound escaped her throat, raw and involuntary, the kind of sound that came from a place beyond conscious control. Her body went rigid, every muscle tensed against the pain, but she did not thrash or try to pull away. Haken paused, meeting her eyes. "Do you want me to stop?" "No," she gasped, the word forced out between clenched teeth. "Finish it," he finished, pulling the edges of skin together with careful precision, tying off each stitch before moving to the next. The work was slow and painstaking, requiring a delicate touch to ensure the wound would heal cleanly. By the time he wrapped her leg in clean cloth, securing the bandage with strips of leather to hold it in place, Amara's face was slick with sweat and her breathing came in ragged bursts. He offered her water, holding the gourd to her lips, and she drank deeply, throat working with desperate gulps. When she was done, he set the gourd aside and added another log to the fire. The night had fully descended now, and the forest beyond the shelter was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. The hoot of an owl somewhere in the branches above, the rustle of something moving through the underbrush, the distant yip of coyotes claiming their territory in voices that rose and fell like a chorus of ghosts. "Why?" Amara asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you help me?" Haken stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his dark eyes, casting dancing shadows across the angular planes of his face. "Because you asked me to kill you," he said slowly, choosing each word with care. "And I have seen too much death to add yours to it." She said nothing for a long moment, and when he finally looked at her, he saw tears tracking silently down her cheeks. She did not sob, did not make a sound, but the tears came nonetheless, carving clean lines through the dirt on her face, revealing the exhaustion and relief and grief that had been held back by sheer force of will. Haken turned away, giving her the privacy of her grief, and busied himself with preparing a simple meal, roasted venison and wild onions. Nothing elaborate, but enough to provide strength. The meat had been drying over his fire for 3 days, seasoned with sage and salt he had traded for at the last outpost. When it was ready, he offered her a portion on a flat piece of bark. She took it with trembling hands and ate slowly, each bite seeming to require immense effort, but she ate nonetheless. Driven by the body's primal need for sustenance, he ate in silence across from her, the fire crackling between them, and for a time, the only sounds were the pop of burning wood and the soft rhythm of their breathing. Outside, the wind rose, carrying with it the scent of coming rain and the distant promise of snow from the higher elevations. Hakan knew the signs intimately, the way the air pressure shifted, the restless movement of the trees, the particular quality of the clouds that gathered along the mountain peaks. A storm was building over the mountains, and it would reach them by morning. He secured the lean-to's hide coverings, tying them down against the wind, and checked his traps and supplies, ensuring everything was properly stored and protected. When he returned to the fire, Amara had finished eating and was lying back against the fir boughs, her eyes half closed, exhaustion finally claiming her. He added his own blanket to the elk hide covering her, a thick wool trade blanket he had acquired 2 winters ago. Ignoring the chill that immediately settled over his own skin, she did not thank him, but her eyes opened briefly, meeting his with something that might have been gratitude or might have been confusion. He could not tell which, and it did not matter. "Sleep," he said. "You are safe here, safe," she repeated, as though testing the weight of the word on her tongue, as though trying to remember what it meant. "I have not been safe since the day I was born." Haken had no answer for that, no comfort to offer that would not ring hollow against the truth of her experience. Instead, he settled on the opposite side of the fire, his back against the stone wall of the cliff, and kept watch. The night stretched long and cold, and though exhaustion pulled at him like an undertow, he did not allow himself to sleep. Somewhere out there, beyond the circle of firelight, men were hunting. He had seen their tracks days ago, read their intent in the deliberate way they moved through the forest, in the methodical pattern of their search. They were not trappers or soldiers or prospectors. They were something worse, men who hunted other men for profit. And they would not stop until they found what they were looking for. Haken's hand moved to the knife at his belt, fingers curling around the worn handle that fit his palm like an old friend. He had left the world of men behind years ago, choosing solitude over the violence and betrayal that seemed to follow wherever people gathered in numbers. But now, with Amara lying injured in his shelter, her presence a living challenge to the isolation he had cultivated so carefully, he felt the old tension returning, the knowledge that solitude was a luxury he could no longer afford. The fire burned low, embers glowing like distant stars in the darkness, and Haken stared into the night beyond his shelter, listening for the sounds that did not belong. The snap of a twig under a careless boot, the scrape of leather on stone, the whisper of voices carried on the wind. He heard nothing yet, but he knew they were coming. Men like that always did. Dawn arrived not with light, but with sound, the persistent drumming of rain against the cedar bark roof, and the low rumble of thunder rolling through the mountain passes, like distant cannon fire. Haken woke from a sleep he had not intended to take, his body having finally surrendered to exhaustion sometime in the hours before sunrise. The fire had burned down to ash and ember, and the shelter held a bone-deep chill that spoke of autumn's relentless march toward winter. He rose quickly, feeding the fire with dry kindling he kept stored in a leather pouch, coaxing the flames back to life with practiced efficiency. Across the shelter, Amara still slept, her breathing deep and even, the first real rest she had likely experienced in weeks. Her face had lost some of its tension during the night, though pain still etched fine lines around her eyes and mouth. Haken moved quietly, not wanting to wake her, and stepped outside into the gray morning. The rain fell in sheets, turning the forest floor into a maze of puddles and streams that had not existed the night before. Water poured off the edges of the lean-to's roof, creating a curtain that obscured the world beyond. Haken stood just inside the shelter's entrance, letting the mist touch his face, and studied the transformed landscape with growing unease. Rain was both blessing and curse in situations like this. It would wash away tracks, making it harder for anyone to follow a trail, but it would also drive men to seek shelter, to push harder toward known refuges and hiding places. If the men hunting Amara knew these mountains at all, they would know that options for shelter grew scarce the higher one climbed, and they would be checking every cave, every overhang, every structure that might provide protection from the storm. He returned inside and found Amara awake, her eyes tracking him with that same wary alertness he had seen the day before. She tried to sit up, gasping as the movement sent pain shooting through her injured leg. Haken crossed to her quickly, placing a hand on her shoulder to ease her back down. "Do not move yet," he said. "Your body needs time to heal." "How long have I slept?" she asked, her voice rough with sleep and thirst. "Through the night," he replied, reaching for the water gourd. She drank gratefully, and he noticed how her hands shook less than they had the evening before, a small sign that her body was beginning to recover from the shock of injury. When she finished drinking, he offered her dried berries and more venison, which she accepted without hesitation. While she ate, he examined her bandages, relieved to see that no fresh blood had seeped through the cloth. The yarrow paste was doing its work, keeping infection at bay, at least for now. The rain continued its assault on the mountains throughout the morning, showing no signs of relenting. Haken occupied himself with small tasks, sharpening his knife on a whetstone, checking his bowstring for wear, sorting through his supply of arrows to ensure the fletching remained intact. All the while, he remained acutely aware of Amara's presence, the way she watched him work, the questions he could sense forming behind her careful silence. Finally, as he was rewrapping the handle of his hatchet with fresh leather cord, she spoke. "How far did I run?" she asked quietly. Before the rocks fell, Håkon paused in his work, considering how to answer. 2 days' journey from the nearest settlement, he said. "Maybe 3 if you were moving at night." She confirmed. "Only at night. During the day I hid," he nodded, understanding the strategy even as he recognized its desperation. Moving only at night through unfamiliar mountain terrain was a calculated risk that spoke to how dire her circumstances must have been. "Smart," he said. "But dangerous, more dangerous to stay where I was," she replied, and there was a flatness to her tone that suggested horrors she had no intention of describing. Håkon did not press. He had learned long ago that some stories could only be told when the teller was ready, and sometimes they could never be told at all. Instead, he returned to his work, giving her space to decide what, if anything, she wanted to share. After a long silence, she spoke again. "There were 5 of us," she said. "We left together. Planned it for months. But they caught 3 of us the first night." She paused, swallowing hard. "I heard the dogs. Heard the screaming. Sarah was my friend since we were children. They made an example of her." Håkon's hand stilled on the leather cord, his jaw tightening. He had heard stories of what happened to runaways who were caught, had seen the scars on the backs of those who had been returned to their masters. The cruelty was deliberate, designed to break spirit as well as body, to serve as warning to others who might dare to choose freedom over bondage. "The other one who escaped with you?" he asked carefully. "What happened, Marcus?" Amara said, and her voice wavered slightly. "He was strong, fast. He led them away from me when we got separated near the river." She closed her eyes. "I do not know if he made it." The shelter fell silent again, filled only with the sound of rain and the crackle of fire. Håkon finished wrapping the hatchet handle and set it aside, then moved to the entrance to scan the forest once more. The visibility was poor, reduced to perhaps 50 feet in any direction, but that worked both ways. If he could not see far, neither could anyone approaching. He had set no traps around his shelter, had never needed to, but now he reconsidered that choice. A few carefully placed snares might provide warning if someone came too close. "You said there were men tracking," Amara said, pulling his attention back. "How many?" "At least 3, Håkon replied. "Maybe more. I found their tracks 2 days before I found you. They were moving in a search pattern, covering ground methodically. They will not stop," she said, and it was not a question. Her voice carried the weight of certainty born from experience. "The man who owns me," she continued, each word seeming to cost her something. "His name is Josiah Harrow. He is a cotton plantation owner from Mississippi. When the war started going badly for the South, he moved his operation west, bringing his property with him." She spat the word property as though it burned her tongue. "He does not tolerate losses. He will have hired the best trackers he could find." "The war," Håkon said, trying to place the timeline. "It has been over for years now." Amara's laugh was bitter and sharp. "The war ended on paper," she said, "but not for people like me. Not in the places where Harrow operates. He still runs his plantation as though nothing changed. The law out here is whatever men with money and guns say it is." Håkon understood that truth all too well. The Oregon Territory was a lawless place in many ways, too vast and too wild for any real governance to take hold. Justice, such as it was, came from whoever had the most power in any given moment, and that power rarely served those who needed it most. He thought of his own people, pushed onto reservations or scattered into the wilderness, their treaties broken as soon as it became convenient for the settlers who wanted their land. The law had not protected them either. One of the trackers, Håkon said. "What does he look like?" Amara's expression darkened. "Silas Crow," she said. "Tall man. Thin like a scarecrow but strong. He has a scar across his throat from someone who tried to kill him and failed. He wears a long coat even in summer and carries 2 pistols. She paused, and when she continued, her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He's the one Harrow always hires.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
He has never lost a trail. The name meant nothing to Hakan, but the description was enough. Men like that existed throughout the frontier, individuals who had found a profitable niche in hunting other human beings. They were often former soldiers or scouts, men who had learned tracking and violence in service of one cause or another, and then turned those skills toward whatever paid best. Hakan had encountered a few over the years, had even been tracked himself once when he first fled into the mountains. He had survived that encounter by being more patient than his pursuer, by understanding the land better than any outsider could. But that had been years ago, and he had been alone then, responsible only for himself. The rain finally began to ease around midday, tapering off to a light drizzle that hung in the air like suspended silk. Hakan knew this was likely just a break in the storm rather than its end. The clouds remained heavy and dark, promising more rain before nightfall. He needed to move, to check his surroundings properly, but leaving Amara alone felt dangerous in ways that went beyond the physical threat of the trackers. She was still weak, still vulnerable, and if something happened to him, she would have no way to defend herself or even to flee. He made a decision. "I need to scout the area," he told her. "Make sure no one has moved close during the storm. I will not go far, and I will return before dark." Amara's eyes widened slightly, and he saw fear flash across her face before she controlled it. "Take me with you," she said. "You cannot walk," he reminded her gently, "then leave me a weapon." She countered, "Something. Anything. I will not sit here defenseless." Hakan hesitated, then reached for his hunting knife, the smaller of the 2 blades he carried. He offered it to her handle first, and she took it with hands that were steadier now, more certain. "If anyone comes," he said, "hide first. Fight only if you must." She nodded, and he saw in her eyes that she understood the stakes, that she had no illusions about what would happen if the trackers found her. He slipped out into the drizzle, moving with the silence that had become second nature over his years in the wilderness. The forest was transformed by the rain, every surface slick and gleaming, the usual sounds muted beneath the constant drip of water from branches and leaves. Hakan moved in a wide circle around his shelter, reading the ground for any sign of disturbance. For the first hour, he found nothing unusual. Just the tracks of deer and elk, the scratches where a bear had marked its territory on a tree trunk, the distinctive prints of a mountain lion that had passed through sometime during the night. But then, as he moved toward the ravine where he had found Amara, he saw them, boot prints, fresh enough that the rain had not yet completely eroded them, leading up from the lower elevations. There were 3 sets of tracks, just as he had estimated, moving in a formation that suggested military training, or at least significant experience working together. They had come within a quarter mile of his shelter before the heaviest rain had driven them to seek cover. Hakan followed the tracks backward, moving carefully, until he found where they had made a temporary camp beneath an outcropping of rock. The ashes of their fire were cold and scattered by rain, but he could see the impressions where they had sat, the place where one of them had leaned his rifle against the stone. They had left perhaps 2 hours ago, continuing their search pattern, but they would be back. The tracks told him they were moving in a grid, systematically covering every possible hiding place. And eventually, that grid would bring them directly to his shelter. He returned quickly, slipping back inside to find Amara exactly where he had left her. The knife gripped in her hand, her whole body tensed for fight or flight despite her injury. When she saw him, her shoulders sagged with relief, but she did not lower the knife until he was fully inside, and she could confirm no one had followed him. They are close, he said without preamble. 3 men. They made camp near the ravine last night. They are searching in a pattern that will bring them here. Maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after. We need to leave, Amara said immediately. You need to take me somewhere else. Somewhere they will not find. Haken shook his head. You cannot travel, not yet. Moving you now would tear open your wounds, and likely cost you the leg, maybe your life. She started to protest, but he held up a hand. There is another way. If they come, I will lead them away from here. Make them follow me instead. They will kill you, she said flatly. Maybe, he acknowledged. Or maybe I know these mountains better than they do. He met her eyes. But if it comes to that, you need to be ready to move on your own. I will show you where to go, how to follow the creek downstream to a trading post where you can find help. I will not leave you to die for me, Amara said. And there was steel in her voice now, a core of strength that had survived everything she had endured. You saved my life. I will not repay that by running while you sacrifice yourself. Then we prepare for both possibilities, Haken said. We hope they pass us by, but we ready ourselves for the worst. They spent the remainder of the daylight hours in preparation. Haken showed Amara how to splint her leg properly so she could put weight on it if absolutely necessary, though the pain would be significant. He packed a small bundle for her, dried meat, a fire starter, a water skin, things she would need if she had to flee on her own. He checked and rechecked his weapons, strung his bow, sharpened both knives until they could split a hair. All the while, the rain returned, heavier than before, drumming against the roof with renewed fury. The storm would provide cover if they needed to move. But it would also make tracking easier for men who knew what they were doing, washing away old signs while preserving fresh ones. As darkness fell and Haken built up the fire against the deepening cold, Amara spoke again. Why are you doing this? She asked. You do not know me. You owe me nothing. Why risk everything? Haken stared into the flames, considering his answer carefully. Because I know what it is to be hunted, he said finally. My people were driven from our lands, killed or forced onto reservations where we were told we must abandon our ways and become something we were not. I chose to leave rather than surrender who I am. He looked at her. You made the same choice. You chose freedom over survival. That is worth defending. Amara's eyes glistened in the firelight, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the storm raged on, and somewhere in the darkness, 3 men moved closer, driven by greed and cruelty and the simple fact that they had been paid to complete a task. But inside the shelter, beside the fire, 2 people who had every reason to distrust the world found themselves trusting each other. Not because it was easy or safe, but because sometimes survival required more than solitude. Sometimes it required the courage to let someone else stand beside you in the darkness. The storm broke 3 hours before dawn, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. Haken woke to that silence, his hand already reaching for the knife at his side before his eyes had fully opened. Something was wrong. The wrongness lived in the absence of sound, in the way even the nocturnal creatures had gone quiet, as though they sensed predators moving through their domain. He rose without disturbing Amara, who still slept fitfully beside the dying fire, and moved to the entrance of the shelter. The sky was beginning to pale in the east, that first suggestion of gray that preceded true dawn. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, and a thin mist clung to the ground like scattered wool. He saw the smoke first, a thin column rising from the valley below, perhaps 2 miles distant. Someone had made camp and felt confident enough to maintain a fire through the morning hours. Haken's jaw tightened. The trackers had stopped their methodical search pattern and established a base, which meant they believed their quarry was close. They were settling in for a different kind of hunt now, one that required patience rather than speed. He watched the smoke for several minutes, memorizing its location, calculating distances and approaches. Then he heard it, the soft snap of a branch breaking under careless weight. Coming from the west, perhaps 300 yards away. He moved back inside quickly, crouching beside Amara and placing a hand gently over her mouth before she could cry out in alarm. Her eyes snapped open, instantly alert, and he felt her body go rigid beneath his palm. "Someone is here," he breathed, barely louder than the whisper of wind through pine needles. "Stay silent. Stay still." She nodded once, and he removed his hand, reaching instead for his bow. He had already strung it the night before, and now he nocked an arrow, the familiar weight of the weapon settling into his hands like an old prayer. He positioned himself just inside the shelter's entrance, where he could see out but would remain hidden in shadow. The figure that emerged from the mist wore a long coat that hung nearly to his knees, and even from a distance, Haken could see the twin pistols holstered at his sides. Silas Crow, the man moved with the careful precision of someone who had spent years learning to read terrain, his head turning slowly as he scanned the forest, searching for any sign of human presence. He was too far away for Hakan to risk a shot with the bow, and any sound would alert the other trackers to their position. Haken remained perfectly still, barely breathing, watching as Crow moved closer, drawn toward the shelter by some instinct or perhaps just methodical thoroughness. Crow stopped perhaps 50 yards from the lean-to, his head tilting as he studied the structure. Haken knew what the tracker was seeing, a shelter that appeared abandoned, weathered by seasons, half hidden by the natural growth of the forest. But Crow was not a fool. He would notice the subtle signs, the way the path leading to the entrance was more worn than it should be, the careful construction that spoke of recent maintenance, the absence of spider webs and debris that accumulated on truly abandoned structures. Hakan watched as the man's hand moved toward one of his pistols, fingers flexing, preparing. Then from somewhere to the south, a gunshot cracked through the morning air, sharp and sudden. Crow's head snapped toward the sound, and for a heartbeat, he stood frozen, calculating. A second shot followed, then a third, and Crow turned away from the shelter, moving quickly back into the forest toward the source of the commotion. Haken waited until the man had disappeared completely before lowering his bow, his heart hammering against his ribs. Behind him, Amara released a shaking breath she had been holding. "What was that?" she whispered. "Either a distraction or they found someone else." Haken replied quietly. "Either way, we need to move, now while they are occupied." "I cannot walk," Amara protested, but even as she spoke, she was already trying to push herself upright, her face contorting with pain. "You can walk enough," Haken said, moving to her side. "I will help you. But we cannot stay here. Crow knows this shelter exists now, and he will return." He helped her to her feet, or rather to one foot, as she kept her injured leg bent to avoid putting weight on it. She leaned heavily against him, and he could feel how she trembled with the effort of staying upright. This would be slow, dangerously slow, but they had no choice. He gathered the essential supplies, his weapons, the medicine pouch, what little food remained, and secured them quickly. Then he wrapped his arm around Amara's waist and began guiding her away from the shelter. Moving deeper into the mountains, they traveled through the morning in a painful, halting progress that tested both their endurance and their nerves. Every 100 yards, Haken would stop to listen, scanning their surroundings for any sign of pursuit. Amara never complained, though he could see the agony etched into every line of her face, could feel how her body grew heavier against him as exhaustion and pain drained her strength. The terrain worked against them, rising steadily as they climbed higher into the mountains, the ground becoming rockier, more treacherous. Several times, Amara's injured leg caught on roots or stones, and she would gasp, biting down hard on her lower lip to keep from crying out. By midday, they had covered perhaps 3 miles, and Haken knew they could not continue much longer. Amara was fading, her skin pale and clammy with shock and exertion, her breathing shallow and rapid. He needed to find shelter, somewhere they could rest and regroup. He remembered a place, a cave system his father had shown him as a child, hidden behind a waterfall that fed into the upper reaches of the creek. It was perhaps another mile ahead, but the path there would be treacherous, requiring them to cross a narrow ridge with steep drops on either side. "Can you continue a little further?" he asked Amara, and she nodded weakly. Though he could see it was pure determination rather than actual capability that drove her answer. He tightened his grip around her waist and pressed forward, moving as quickly as her condition would allow. The sound of the waterfall reached them before they saw it, a low rumble that grew steadily louder as they approached. The falls were not large, perhaps 15 feet high, but they generated enough spray to create a perpetual mist that hung in the air like suspended rain. Behind that curtain of water, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, was the cave entrance. Getting there required crossing the ridge Haken had been dreading. A narrow spine of rock barely 3 feet wide with sheer drops falling away on both sides. He had crossed it many times alone, but with Amara injured and weakened, the crossing would be deadly if either of them misstepped. "There's no other way," he told her, studying her face to gauge whether she had the strength remaining. She looked at the ridge, then at him, and he saw her jaw set with grim determination. "Then we cross," she said simply. Haken went first, moving backward so he could face her, his hands gripping hers tightly. "Step where I step," he instructed. "Look at me, not down." She nodded, and they began the crossing. Each step was an exercise in trust and balance, with Amara's injured leg forcing her to hop on one foot while Haken guided her movement, bearing most of her weight. Halfway across, a gust of wind swept through the canyon, strong enough to make them both sway. Amara's eyes went wide with fear, her grip on his hands tightening until her nails dug into his skin. "Do not look down," Haken repeated, his voice steady and calm despite his own racing heart. "Look at me, you are strong. You can do this." She locked her eyes on his, and they continued, inch by agonizing inch, until finally they reached the far side. Amara collapsed against the rock face, her whole body shaking with exhaustion and terror. Haken gave her only a moment to recover before helping her to her feet again. The cave entrance was close now, just another 50 yards through the mist. The cave was exactly as he remembered, dry and deep, extending back into the mountain perhaps 30 feet before narrowing into passages too small for a human to follow. The entrance was hidden behind the waterfall, accessible only by following a narrow ledge that was constantly slick with spray. Inside, the sound of falling water created a wall of noise that would mask any conversation or movement from outside listeners. Haken helped Amara to the back of the cave where the stone was driest, and she immediately sank down, her injured leg stretched out before her. Her chest heaving with exhausted breaths, he unpacked his supplies quickly, building a small fire using dead wood he found stored in the cave from his last visit years ago. The smoke would be dispersed by the waterfall, making it nearly impossible to detect from outside. When the flames were crackling steadily, he turned his attention to Amara's leg. The bandages were soaked with blood and water, and when he unwrapped them, he found that several of the stitches had torn free during their flight. The wound was bleeding again, though not severely. He cleaned it with water from the cave's small spring, a trickle that emerged from a crack in the stone and pooled in a natural basin before draining away. Then he applied fresh yarrow paste and rewrapped the leg. "Working quickly but carefully, you should have left me," Amara said quietly, watching him work. "You would move faster alone. You could disappear into these mountains where they would never find you." Haken did not look up from his task. "I do not abandon people," he said. "Even strangers," she pressed. "Even someone who brings danger to your door." He finished tying off the bandage and finally met her eyes. "You are not a stranger anymore," he said simply, and the truth of it hung between them. In the space of 2 days, through shared danger and mutual dependence, something had shifted. They were bound now. By circumstance certainly, but also by choice. By the decision each had made to trust the other when trust was the riskiest gamble either could take. Amara's expression softened, and she reached out, her fingers brushing against his hand where it rested on his knee. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried weight beyond their simple sound. "Thank you for seeing me as a person worth saving." Haken did not pull away from her touch, though such contact was foreign to him after years of solitude. "You are worth saving," he said. "Whatever the men who owned you believed, whatever lies they told themselves to justify their cruelty, you are a person deserving of freedom and life." He paused, then added, "My people were told we were savages, that we had no souls, that the land we had lived on for generations was wasted on us. I know what it is to be seen as less than human. I will not treat you that way." Tears welled in Amara's eyes, and this time she did not try to hide them. She had spent so long being strong, so long refusing to show weakness because weakness meant death. But here, in this cave behind a waterfall, with a Modoc hunter who had risked everything to keep her alive, she finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had endured and what she had been given. Haken moved closer, and when she leaned forward, resting her forehead against his shoulder, he did not pull away. He simply sat with her, letting her cry, his hand coming up to rest gently on her back. They stayed that way for a long time, the fire burning low beside them, the waterfall creating its constant wall of sound. Eventually, Amara's tears subsided, and she pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I am sorry," she said. "Do not apologize for being human," Haken replied. He added more wood to the fire, and they shared the last of his dried venison, eating in companionable silence. Outside, the day was advancing toward evening, and Haken knew they would need to make decisions soon about what came next. The cave was a good hiding place, but it was not a permanent solution. They would need food beyond what he carried, and Amara's leg would need more time to heal before she could travel any real distance. "Tell me about your people," Amara said after a while, breaking the silence. "Tell me about the Modoc." Haken stared into the fire, considering where to begin. "We are a small tribe," he said. "We lived near the Great Lake, what the white men call Tule Lake, on the border between Oregon and California. The lake gave us everything: fish and waterfowl, reeds for building, water for our crops. We lived there for generations, following the seasons, respecting the land." He paused, his expression darkening. "Then the settlers came. They wanted the land for cattle and farms. They did not understand that we had lived there first, that we had treaties promising us the right to stay. Or perhaps they understood and simply did not care." "What happened?" Amara asked gently. "War," Haken said. "Years of fighting, of broken promises and betrayals. My father was killed in a battle near the lava beds. My mother died of sickness brought by the settlers, a disease we had no immunity against. By the time I was grown, most of my people had been forced onto reservations or scattered into hiding. I chose to leave rather than live in a cage." He met her eyes. "So I understand what you have run from. Different chains perhaps, but chains nonetheless. Do you ever think about going back?" Amara asked. "To your people, sometimes," Haken admitted. "But the world I knew is gone. The lake is surrounded by fences now, divided into parcels owned by men who have no connection to the land. My people who remain are shadows of what we were, forbidden to speak our language, to practice our traditions, to be who we are." He shook his head. "I cannot go back to something that no longer exists." "Then we are the same," Amara said quietly. "Both running from a past we cannot return to, both searching for a future that may not exist." "The future exists," Haken said with unexpected conviction. "We make it exist by surviving, by refusing to give up, by choosing to believe that tomorrow can be better than today." He gestured to the cave around them, to the fire and the supplies, and the fact that they were both still alive, despite everything that had tried to kill them. We are still here. That is enough for now. As darkness fell outside the cave, Haken kept watch at the entrance, peering through the waterfall at the forest beyond. He saw no sign of the trackers, heard nothing beyond the natural sounds of the wilderness settling into night. Perhaps Crow and his men were still searching the lower elevations. Perhaps the gunshots had drawn them away temporarily, or perhaps they were simply waiting, knowing that injured prey would eventually have to emerge from hiding. Whatever the reason, they had been granted a reprieve, and Haken intended to use it wisely. He returned to the fire to find Amara struggling to stay awake, her body finally demanding the rest it desperately needed. "Sleep," he told her. "I will keep watch." She wanted to argue, he could see it in her eyes, but exhaustion won out. She lay down carefully, mindful of her injured leg, and within moments, her breathing had deepened into sleep. Haken sat with his back against the cave wall, bow across his lap, and watched the fire burn. The flames painted shifting shadows on the stone walls, and in those shadows, he saw the ghosts of his past. His father teaching him to track elk through deep snow. His mother singing songs in the language he rarely spoke anymore, his people. Gathered around communal fires before the wars began. But he also saw something else in the flames, something unexpected and fragile. A possible future where he was not alone, where Amara's presence was not just a temporary responsibility, but something more lasting. The thought both frightened and intrigued him, because it meant abandoning the solitude that had defined his existence for so long. It meant choosing connection over isolation, choosing to risk the pain that came with caring about another person. He looked at Amara sleeping beside the fire, at the strength visible even in her exhaustion, at the courage that had driven her to flee bondage even when flight meant probable death. She deserved better than to spend her life running and hiding. They both did. Outside the cave, the night deepened, and somewhere in that darkness, 3 men continued their hunt. But for now, in a cave behind a waterfall in the heart of the Cascade Mountains, 2 people who had every reason to give up, instead chose to hope, and that hope, fragile as it was, burned brighter than any fire. The sun was already high when Haken woke, which meant he had slept far longer than he had intended. His body had betrayed his vigilance sometime in the early morning hours, exhaustion finally claiming what alertness could no longer sustain. He sat up quickly, reaching for his bow, his eyes scanning the cave entrance for any sign of intrusion. The waterfall still roared its constant song, and beyond it, the forest appeared undisturbed. Amara was awake, sitting with her back against the stone wall, her injured leg stretched before her. She was watching him with an expression he could not quite read, something between concern and calculation. "You let yourself sleep," she said. It was not an accusation, merely an observation. "I did not mean to," Haken admitted, frustrated with himself. He moved to the cave entrance, studying the forest beyond with practiced eyes. Nothing seemed out of place, but that meant little. Good trackers knew how to move without disturbing the natural order of things, knew how to become part of the landscape rather than an intrusion upon it. He returned to the fire, which had burned down to embers during the night, and began building it back up. "We need to make plans," he said. "We cannot hide here forever." "I know," Amara replied quietly. "My leg is stronger today. I think I could walk if I had to, though not far or fast." She paused, then added, "You have done more than anyone could ask. If you need to leave me here, to save yourself, I would understand." Haken's response was immediate and sharp. "No, we leave together or not at all." He saw her eyes widen slightly at the vehemence in his tone, and he softened his voice. "I told you before, I do not abandon people." "That has not changed. Then what do we do?" she asked. "We have little food left. My wounds need more time to heal properly, and those men are still out there searching. Every day we stay in one place, they draw closer. Every day we try to move, we risk being seen. She met his eyes. What choice do we have that does not end with one or both of us dead? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of their circumstances. Haken had been turning it over in his mind throughout the night during the hours before sleep claimed him. There were no good options, only varying degrees of risk.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
They could continue running deeper into the mountains, but winter was coming and the higher elevations would soon become impassable. They could try to circle back down toward the settlements, but that would bring them closer to the trackers and to the civilization that had enslaved Amara in the first place. Or they could make a stand, force a confrontation on their terms rather than waiting to be discovered. "There is a trading post," Haken said slowly, working through the idea as he spoke. 3 days' travel east from here, run by a man named Gideon Frost. He is fair, deals honestly with natives and settlers alike. He has no love for slave catchers or bounty hunters. If we could reach him, he might help us. He could provide supplies, maybe even horses. From there, you could travel north into British territory where the slave laws do not reach. 3 days, Amara repeated, looking down at her injured leg. "Can I make it that far?" "Not quickly," Haken admitted. "And not without risk. But if we move carefully, use the terrain to our advantage, avoid the obvious paths, we might stay ahead of the trackers long enough to reach Frost." He crouched beside her, checking her bandages. The bleeding had stopped completely now, and the swelling had reduced. The yarrow was doing its work. "Your wounds are healing well. With another day of rest and proper binding, you should be able to manage short distances. Another day here, though," Amara said. "That gives them another day to find us," Haken nodded. "Which is why today I scout. I need to know where they are, how they are moving, what their patterns look like. If I can map their search grid, I can find the gaps, the spaces where we can move without being seen." He stood, gathering his weapons. "You will stay here, keep the fire small, stay away from the entrance. If anyone comes and it is not me, you hide in the back passages no matter how small they are." "And if you do not return?" Amara asked, her voice steady but her eyes revealing her fear. "Then you wait 1 full day," Haken said. "If I am not back by tomorrow at this time, you follow the creek downstream. Stay in the water to hide your tracks. After about 5 miles, you will reach a split where the creek divides. Take the right fork. Follow it for another day, and you will reach Frost's trading post. Tell him Haken sent you. Tell him what happened. He will help you." Amara opened her mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. Instead, she simply nodded, accepting the plan even as she clearly hated every part of it. Haken gathered what he needed, his bow, a quiver of arrows, both knives, and a small pouch of dried meat. He left the rest of their supplies with Amara, including the fire starter and the medicine pouch. Before leaving, he knelt beside her one more time. "I will return," he said, and there was something in his voice that made it sound like a promise. Rather than a hope. "I know you will," Amara replied, and she reached out to touch his hand briefly. "Be careful. Those men are killers." "So am I," Haken said quietly, and for the first time, Amara saw something dangerous flash behind his usually calm exterior, a reminder that this man who had been so gentle with her injuries was also a predator. In his own right, shaped by survival and necessity into something that could be deadly when circumstances required it. He left the cave as the sun was climbing toward its zenith, slipping through the waterfall and emerging into the forest beyond. The world outside was bright and clear, the storm having washed the air clean and left everything smelling of wet earth and pine. Haken moved through the trees like a ghost, his feet finding purchase on stone and root rather than soft earth that would hold prints. He had learned this way of moving as a child, had perfected it through years of hunting both animals and the occasional need to avoid army patrols. Now he employed every skill he possessed, every lesson his father had taught him, every instinct that had kept him alive through winters and conflicts and the slow erosion of his people's world. He found the first sign of the trackers within an hour, a boot print in soft mud near a game trail. The print was fresh, made within the last few hours, and it pointed north, away from the cave. Haken studied it carefully, noting the wear pattern on the sole, the depth of the impression that suggested the weight of the man who had made it. This was not Crow, the print was too small. One of the other two then. He followed the trail for a quarter-mile, moving parallel to it rather than directly on it, until he found where the tracker had stopped to examine something. A broken branch perhaps, or the remains of an old campfire. From a concealed position behind a fallen log, Haken watched and waited. Patience was the hunter's greatest weapon, the ability to remain still while the world moved around you. His father had taught him this by making him sit motionless beside a deer trail for hours at a time, learning to ignore discomfort and distraction, learning to become part of the landscape. Now that training served him as he observed the tracker's methods. The way the man moved in a grid pattern, checking every possible hiding place. The way he marked certain trees with a knife to indicate areas already searched. The tracker was good, Haken had to admit. Not exceptional, but competent and thorough. He would eventually find the cave if given enough time. But competence could be exploited, turned into predictability. Haken watched long enough to understand the man's rhythm, then moved on, circling wide to find the others. He located the second tracker near midday, a heavier man who moved more slowly but with the same methodical approach. This one was working a section of forest about 2 miles south of the cave, which meant they were tightening their search perimeter, closing in from multiple directions. Haken did not find Silas Crow until late afternoon, and when he did, he understood immediately why this man had such a fearsome reputation. Crow was not following a grid pattern like his companions. Instead, he was reading the land itself, looking for the subtle signs that indicated human presence. The places where deer trails were avoided, where natural cover had been disturbed, where the forest's usual patterns had been altered by someone trying to remain hidden. Worse, Crow was moving in a spiral pattern that was slowly tightening around the waterfall area. He had not found the cave yet, but his instincts were leading him in the right direction. From his concealed position in the branches of a massive Douglas fir, Haken watched Crow work. The man moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long experience. His head constantly moving, taking in everything, processing information with the cold efficiency of someone who had turned tracking into an art form. The twin pistols at his sides were well maintained, the holsters positioned for quick draw. The long coat that had seemed strange in the forest now made sense. It provided protection from branches and thorns, while also concealing additional weapons. Haken could see at least 2 knives, a small hatchet, and what appeared to be a coil of rope. As Haken watched, Crow suddenly stopped, his head tilting as though listening to something beyond normal hearing. Then slowly, deliberately, he turned and looked directly at the tree where Haken was hidden. For a heart-stopping moment, their eyes met across the distance, and Haken saw recognition flare in Crow's gaze. The tracker's hand moved toward his pistol with serpent-quick speed, but Haken was already moving, dropping from the branch and rolling as he hit the ground. The first shot rang out before he had fully regained his feet, the bullet shattering bark where his head had been seconds before. Haken ran, not in panic but with purpose. Leading Crow away from the cave, away from Amara, he moved through the forest in a zigzag pattern, using trees for cover, staying low. More shots followed, but Crow was firing at sound and movement rather than clear targets, and his bullets found only wood and stone. Haken heard the tracker shouting, calling his companions, and knew he had perhaps 10 minutes before all 3 were converging on his position. He needed to create distance, needed to make them chase him far enough that they would not stumble upon the cave while hunting him. He led them on a chase that lasted hours, always staying just ahead, occasionally allowing them to catch a glimpse of him to keep them committed to the pursuit. He crossed streams to break his scent trail, climbed rock faces that would force them to find alternate routes, doubled back on his own path to confuse their tracking. The three men were skilled, but Haken had advantages they lacked. This was his territory, land he had explored for years. And he knew every ravine, every cliff, every place where the forest itself could become a weapon. As dusk approached, Haken finally managed to lose them in a maze of lava tubes and rock formations left behind by ancient volcanic activity. He concealed himself in a narrow crevice barely wide enough for his body and listened as the trackers searched the area around him, their frustrated voices carrying through the still evening air. He heard Crow cursing, giving orders to his men to make camp and resume the search at first light. They were perhaps half a mile from Hakon's position, which meant they were nearly 5 miles from the cave. Far enough, he hoped, to keep Amara safe for another night. When full darkness had fallen and the tracker's campfire was visible as a distant point of light, Haken finally moved. His body ached from the day's exertions, and several times during the chase he had taken minor injuries. A gash on his arm from a sharp branch, bruised ribs from a fall, scratches across his face from pushing through dense undergrowth. But he was alive, and more importantly, he had bought them time. The trek back to the cave took most of the night, as he moved slowly and carefully, ensuring he left no trail that could be followed back to their hiding place. He arrived at the waterfall just as false dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky. He was exhausted, bleeding, and running on nothing but determination and concern for Amara, when he slipped through the waterfall and into the cave. He found her awake, sitting near a small fire with his knife gripped in her hand. The relief that flooded her face when she saw him was so intense it was almost painful to witness. She tried to stand, forgetting her injured leg in her haste, and nearly fell. Haken caught her, and for a moment they simply held each other, both trembling with the aftermath of fear and the profound relief of reunion. "I heard the shots," Amara said, her voice breaking. "I thought they had killed you. I thought I would be alone again." "I am here," Haken said, his arms tightening around her. "I am alive. We are both alive." He pulled back enough to look at her face, seeing tears tracking down her cheeks. "I led them away, far away. We have time now, maybe a day, maybe 2 before they find their way back to this area. Then we leave," Amara said firmly. "Tomorrow, as soon as there is light enough to travel. I can walk. I will walk. We go to this trading post you spoke of, and we do not stop until we reach it." Haken studied her face, seeing the determination there, the refusal to be a burden any longer. He saw too the way she looked at him, with something beyond gratitude, something that made his chest tighten in ways he had not felt since before his world had fallen apart. He nodded slowly. "Tomorrow," he agreed. "At first light. But tonight, we rest. Both of us. We will need all our strength for what comes next." They sat together by the fire as the night deepened around them. And Haken told her about what he had seen, about the trackers and their methods, about Crow's deadly efficiency and the narrow margins by which he had escaped. Amara listened intently, asking questions, helping him plan their route for the following day. As they talked, Haken cleaned and bandaged his wounds, and Amara insisted on helping despite her own injury, her hands gentle but sure as she worked. There was an intimacy to the moment that went beyond the physical act of tending wounds. It was the intimacy of 2 people who had seen each other at their most vulnerable, who had trusted each other with their lives, who had chosen again and again to stand together when standing alone would have been safer. When the bandaging was done, they sat close to each other, shoulders touching, watching the fire burn. Neither spoke of the feelings that were growing between them, both perhaps afraid that naming such things would make them more fragile. more likely to shatter under the weight of their circumstances. But the feelings were there nonetheless, unspoken but undeniable, visible in the way Hakon's hand found hers in the darkness, in the way Amara's fingers intertwined with his and held on as though she would never let go. Outside the cave, the forest settled into the deep quiet of true night, and somewhere in that darkness, 3 men slept beside their fire, confident that morning would bring them closer to their prey. But inside the cave, 2 people who had every reason to despair instead chose hope. And in that choice, they found something neither had expected to find again: the courage to believe that tomorrow might offer more than just survival, that it might offer the chance to truly live. The journey to Gideon Frost's trading post began before the sun had fully risen, when the world existed in that liminal space between darkness and light, where shadows held more substance than form. Hakon helped Amara through the waterfall, steadying her as the spray soaked them both, and the rocks beneath their feet threatened treachery with every step. Her leg had healed enough to bear weight, though he could see how each step cost her. The way her jaw clenched against pain she refused to voice. The slight hitch in her breathing that spoke of endurance, pushed to its limits. They moved east, following game trails that wound through dense forest where the canopy overhead filtered the growing daylight into scattered coins of gold. Hakon had fashioned a walking stick for Amara from a sturdy branch of mountain ash, and she used it to take pressure off her injured leg as they navigated the uneven terrain. Their pace was slow, perhaps a mile every 2 hours, but it was steady and deliberate. Hakon chose their path carefully, avoiding open spaces where they might be visible from a distance, staying close to cover, moving through areas where the ground was rocky enough that their passage would leave minimal trace. Every hour he would stop and listen, scanning their surroundings for any sign that they were being followed. So far, the forest remained undisturbed behind them, but he knew that could change at any moment. By midday, they had put perhaps 6 miles between themselves and the cave, and Amara was beginning to falter. Hakan called a halt near a small stream that cut through a narrow ravine, helping her sit on a flat stone near the water's edge. He refilled their water skins while she rested, then offered her the last of their dried venison. She ate mechanically, her attention focused on the forest around them rather than the food. She had developed the same hypervigilance that Hakon carried, that constant awareness of surroundings that marked those who had learned that danger could come from any direction without warning. "Tell me about this man Frost," Amara said between bites. "Why do you trust him?" Hakon settled beside her, his own eyes never stopping their sweep of their surroundings. "I do not know if trust is the right word," he said, "but he has always dealt fairly with me. When I first came to these mountains, I was young and knew little of surviving alone. I tried to trade pelts at several outposts and was cheated at most of them, given a fraction of what the furs were worth, because I was Indian and they assumed I would not know better." He paused, remembering. Frost was different. He looked at my pelts, told me exactly what they were worth, and paid me fairly. When I thanked him, he said that cheating a man because of the color of his skin was poor business and poorer character. "I have traded with him ever since. That does not mean he will help me," Amara said quietly. "Helping an escaped slave is different than fair trading. It is dangerous, possibly illegal depending on how the laws are interpreted out here." "Why would he risk that?" "Because I will ask him to," Hakon replied simply. "And because I believe he's the kind of man who sees right and wrong more clearly than he sees profit and loss." He met her eyes. "But you are correct that it is a risk. If I have misjudged him, we will need to leave quickly and find another way north. That is why we approach carefully, why I will go in first while you wait hidden nearby." "No," Amara said firmly. "We have come this far together. We continue together. I will not hide while you take risks for me. If this man Frost is who you believe he is, then I want to meet him myself, to look him in the eyes and know whether I can trust him. And if he is not, then we face that together too. Haken wanted to argue, to insist that his way was safer. But he saw the steel in her gaze and recognized it for what it was. Not stubbornness, but the reclamation of agency. The refusal to be protected to the point of helplessness. She had spent too much of her life having decisions made for her by others, and now that she had seized control of her own fate, she would not surrender it again, not even to someone who meant well. He nodded slowly, accepting her terms. They continued through the afternoon, the terrain gradually shifting from dense forest to more open woodland, interspersed with meadows of tall grass that had gone golden with the approach of autumn. The walking was easier here, but the exposure made Haken nervous. They skirted the edges of the meadows rather than crossing them directly, staying close to the tree line where they could disappear quickly if needed. Twice, they heard sounds that made them freeze and take cover. Once the distant crack of a rifle shot that might have been a hunter, or might have been something more sinister. And once the sound of horses moving through the forest to their south. Both times, they waited in tense silence until the sounds faded and the forest returned to its normal rhythms. As evening approached, they reached a ridge that overlooked a small valley. And there, nestled against the far slope, was Frost's trading post. It was larger than Haken remembered, having grown in the years since his last visit. The main building was constructed of hewn logs chinked with moss and clay, with a covered porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys, suggesting the building was divided into living quarters and trading space. Behind the main structure stood a barn, a smokehouse, and several smaller outbuildings whose purposes Haken could only guess. A corral held perhaps a dozen horses, and he could see movement near the barn that suggested other people were present. "We wait for dark," Haken said. "Approach when there are fewer eyes to see us." Amara nodded, and they settled into a concealed position among the rocks on the ridge, watching as the last light faded from the sky and lamps were lit in the trading post windows. Haken counted 3 distinct figures moving about the compound, Frost himself, recognizable by his height and the distinctive limp he had acquired from some long-ago injury, and 2 others who appeared to be employees or perhaps travelers who had stopped for the night. When full darkness had fallen and the activity around the trading post had quieted, Haken helped Amara down from the ridge. They approached from the north, moving slowly, giving anyone watching plenty of time to see they were not trying to sneak up on the compound. Haken had his weapons but kept them secured, his hands visible and empty as they walked into the sphere of light cast by the lanterns. They were perhaps 50 feet from the porch when a door opened and Gideon Frost stepped out. A rifle held casually but ready in his hands. "That is far enough," Frost called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "State your business or move along. I do not welcome strangers after dark. Gideon, it is Haken, the Modoc hunter. I have traded with you these past years. I come seeking help." There was a pause as Frost peered into the darkness, then recognition dawned on his weathered face. "Haken," he said, and there was surprise in his voice. "I had heard rumors the army was looking for you again. Figured you had moved deeper into the mountains." He noticed Amara then, his eyes taking in her injured leg, her exhausted state, the way she leaned on the walking stick. "And who is your companion?" "Someone who needs help more than I do," Haken replied. "May we approach?" "I give you my word we mean no harm." Frost studied them for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. Then he lowered the rifle and gestured toward the porch. "Come on then. But slowly, and keep your hands where I can see them." Haken and Amara walked forward, and as they climbed the steps to the porch, Frost got his first clear look at Amara's face. His expression shifted, understanding dawning, and Haken saw the older man's jaw tighten. "Inside," he said quietly. "Quickly. There are eyes everywhere these days. And not all of them friendly." The interior of the trading post was warm and cluttered, every available surface covered with goods for trade or sale. Pelts hung from the rafters, tools lined the walls, sacks of flour and beans were stacked in corners, and the smell of coffee and tobacco and leather filled the air. Frost led them past the main trading area into a smaller room that served as his living quarters, closing and barring the door behind them. He gestured for them to sit at a rough wooden table while he poured coffee from a pot that sat warming at the edge of his fireplace. "Now then," Frost said, settling into a chair across from them. "Suppose you tell me what kind of trouble has followed you to my door." He looked at Amara with eyes that were sharp but not unkind. "And I suspect you are at the center of it, young lady. No offense meant, but I have seen enough of the world to recognize a runaway when I see one." Amara straightened in her chair despite her exhaustion, meeting Frost's gaze directly. "My name is Amara Collins," she said. "I am escaped property of a man named Josiah Harrow, a plantation owner who brought his operation west when the war turned against the South. I have been running for 3 weeks. Haken found me injured and has kept me alive since. Now there are 3 trackers hunting me, led by a man named Silas Crow. We need supplies, horses if you can spare them, and information about the safest route north into British territory." Frost listened without interruption, his expression growing grimmer as she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table. "Crow," he said finally. "That is a name I know and do not care for. He has passed through here twice in recent months, always hunting someone, always willing to pay for information." He looked at Haken. "You have made a powerful enemy, my friend. Crow does not stop until he completes a job or dies trying." "I know," Haken said. "We have been running for days. We cannot run much longer. Amara needs time for her injuries to fully heal, and winter is coming. If we try to cross the northern passes in another month, we will freeze before reaching safety." Frost nodded slowly, then stood and moved to a cabinet in the corner of the room. He pulled out a map, unrolling it on the table and weighing down the corners with various objects. "This is what you need to understand," he said, pointing to various locations marked on the map. "The passes to the north are already becoming dangerous. In 2 weeks, maybe 3, they will be impassable until spring. Your window for escape that direction is closing rapidly." He traced a line with his finger. "However, there is another option. West to the coast, then north by ship. It is a longer journey, but safer this time of year. I know a ship captain in Astoria who owes me a favor. A man who does not ask questions about his passengers and who has made runs to British Columbia before." "How far to Astoria?" Haken asked, studying the map. 5 days hard riding for someone in good health," Frost replied. "For someone injured, perhaps 7 or 8. You would need to avoid the main trails, stay to the wilderness routes." He looked at them seriously. "And you would need to leave soon, possibly tomorrow. Crow is not far behind you if I know his methods. And he will come here eventually to ask questions." "What will you tell him?" Amara asked. Her voice steady but her eyes revealing her fear. Frost met her gaze without flinching. "I will tell him I have not seen you, which will be the truth after you leave." He leaned back in his chair. "I do not hold with slavery, never have. My own grandmother was Cherokee, taken from her people as a child and forced to work in a household back east. She told me stories before she died, stories that made it clear what it means to be owned by another human being." He shook his head. "The war was supposed to end all that, but men like Harrow found ways around the new laws, moved west where enforcement is weak and money buys whatever version of justice you prefer. I will not be part of perpetuating that evil." Relief flooded through Amara so powerfully that tears sprang to her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you for seeing me as a person worth helping." Frost stood and moved to another cabinet, pulling out supplies and setting them on the table. 2 horses, he said. "Both strong and sure-footed. Supplies enough for 10 days, more if you ration carefully. A map showing the safest route to Astoria. And this, he produced a small leather pouch. Coins enough to pay for your passage north, and to start a new life once you arrive. Consider it payment for all the times I should have given Håkon more for his pelts, but did not because I was more concerned with my own profit than with fairness. Håkon started to protest, but Frost held up a hand. This is not charity, he said. This is one old man trying to balance accounts before he meets his maker. You take what I offer, and you use it to build something good, something that proves there is still hope in this broken world. That is payment enough. They spent the night in Frost's storage room, sleeping on pallets made of blankets and furs, with a barred door between them and anyone who might come looking. Frost woke them before dawn, helping them pack the supplies and ready the horses. The animals he provided were indeed strong, a roan mare and a black gelding, both with the sturdy build and calm temperament needed for mountain travel. As the first light began to paint the eastern sky, Håkon and Amara prepared to leave. One more thing, Frost said as they were mounting. He handed Håkon a rifle, newer and better maintained than the old musket Håkon had abandoned at his shelter. You may need this before you reach the coast. And this, he pressed a piece of paper into Amara's hand, is the name of the ship captain in Astoria and where to find him. Tell him Gideon sent you. He will ask no questions and keep no records of your passage. Why are you doing all this? Amara asked, looking down at the old trader from atop her horse. You risk so much for strangers, Frost smiled, and for a moment, the hard lines of his weathered face softened. Because someone once did the same for my grandmother, he said. A Quaker family hid her when she ran from the household that enslaved her, helped her reach safety despite the danger to themselves. She always said that kindness was a debt that could only be repaid by passing it forward. He stepped back. Now go quickly, before the world wakes up and starts asking questions I would rather not answer. They rode west as the sun rose behind them, casting their shadows long across the ground. The horses moved with an easy gait that ate up the miles without jarring Amara's injured leg, and for the first time in days, Håkon allowed himself to feel something approaching hope. They rode through the morning and into the afternoon, following game trails and old logging roads that wound through the mountains, always moving toward the distant coast that promised escape and freedom. On the second day of their journey, as they stopped to water the horses at a creek crossing, Amara finally spoke the words that had been building between them since the cave. When we reach British territory, she said quietly, what will you do? Will you return to your mountains, to your solitary life? Håkon had been asking himself the same question, and now, standing beside her with the sound of running water filling the silence, he found his answer. No, he said. I will not go back. That life belongs to who I was, not who I am becoming. He turned to face her fully. If you will have me, I will stay with you. We will build a new life together, somewhere we can both be free. Amara's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. I would like that, she said. I would like that very much. She reached out and took his hand, and this time, there was no hesitation in the touch, no uncertainty about what it meant. They stood together beside the creek, two people who had been broken by the world and had somehow found in each other the pieces needed to become whole again. They reached Astoria on the 7th day, arriving as the afternoon sun painted the Columbia River in shades of copper and gold. The town was a rough collection of buildings clustered around the docks where ships from around the world came to trade timber and furs. Håkon found the Captain Frost had mentioned, a Norwegian named Lars Hendrik, who looked them over with shrewd eyes but asked no questions beyond their destination and whether they had coin for passage. When Håkon showed him the letter from Frost and counted out the coins, Hendrik nodded once and told them his ship would sail with the morning tide. That night, standing on the dock watching the sun set over the Pacific Ocean, Amara leaned against Håkon and spoke softly. Do you think they are still looking for us? She asked. Crow and the others, probably, Håkon admitted. Men like that do not give up easily. But we have given them a trail that ends at Frost's trading post and goes nowhere beyond. Eventually, they will have to report failure to whoever hired them. And by then, we will be far beyond their reach. I keep thinking about that moment in the canyon, Amara said. When I asked you to kill me, I was so certain that death was the only escape left to me, that there was no hope for anything better. She turned to look at him, her face illuminated by the dying light. Thank you for proving me wrong. Thank you for showing me that there is still kindness in the world, still people willing to risk everything for what is right. You gave me something as well, Haken said. You reminded me that solitude is not the same as peace, that running from the world is not the same as finding freedom. You taught me that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let someone else share our burdens. Trust them with our lives and our hearts. They boarded Hendrik's ship the next morning, standing at the rail as the vessel cast off and began its journey north along the coast. Behind them, the Oregon Territory grew smaller and more distant, and with it, the chains of their pasts began to fall away. Ahead lay British Columbia and an uncertain future, but they would face it together. Two survivors who had found in each other not just safety, but something far more precious. The courage to hope, the strength to heal, and the love that emerges when two broken people choose to be vulnerable with each other. As the ship rounded a bend in the coast, and the last sight of American territory disappeared behind them, Amara took Hakon's hand and whispered, "We made it." "We are free." Haken squeezed her hand gently, his eyes on the northern horizon. "Yes," he said. "We are free. And now we begin." The sun broke through the clouds overhead, washing the deck in golden light, and for the first time in longer than either could remember, the future held not fear but promise. They had survived the worst that the world could throw at them, had endured pain and loss and the relentless pursuit of those who sought to destroy them. But they had also found something that neither had expected. In each other, they had discovered that even in the darkest moments, even when death seemed certain and hope appeared lost, the human spirit could still choose love over fear, could still reach out across the darkness and find another hand reaching back. And in that connection, find the strength not just to survive, but to truly live. The cabin stood in a clearing carved from the dense forests of Vancouver Island, its log walls weathered to a silver gray that caught the morning light like polished stone. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, steady column, carrying with it the scent of fir wood and the bread that Amara had learned to bake in the cast iron Dutch oven Haken had traded for at the settlement. The garden they had planted in spring was now yielding its autumn harvest, rows of squash and beans and potatoes that would see them through the coming winter. Beyond the clearing, the forest stretched in every direction, dense and green, and alive with the sounds of a world that had finally stopped hunting them. Haken stood at the woodpile, his axe rising and falling in a steady rhythm that had become as natural as breathing. His hair had grown longer over the past year, now reaching past his shoulders and tied back with a strip of leather. Amara had decorated with small beads she had purchased from a Salish woman at the trading post. The scar on his arm from their flight through the Cascade Mountains had faded to a thin white line, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. His body had filled out slightly, the constant edge of tension that had defined him for so many years, gradually softening as safety became not just a hope, but a reality. The sound of the door opening drew his attention, and he turned to see. Amara emerged from the cabin, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. She moved with only the slightest hitch in her gait now, the injury to her leg having healed as completely as such wounds ever do. Her hair was braided in a style she had learned from the Salish women who had welcomed them into their community, and she wore a dress of simple cotton that she had sewn herself, dyed a deep blue with berries gathered from the forest. The haunted look that had shadowed her eyes when they first met had been replaced by something softer, a peace that came from knowing she was truly free, that no one could ever own her again. "You work too hard," she said, handing him one of the cups. "We have enough wood for 3 winters already." Haken accepted the coffee gratefully, wiping sweat from his brow with his sleeve. "Old habits," he replied with a slight smile. "In the winter of my 7th year, we did not have enough wood and my mother nearly froze. I swore then I would never let that happen again." He sipped the coffee, strong and bitter the way he preferred it. "Besides, the work feels good." Purposeful, Amara leaned against the wood pile beside him, her shoulder touching his in the easy. Intimacy they had developed over months of shared labor and shared life. "Everything here feels purposeful," she said. "Building this cabin, planting the garden, learning to preserve food for winter. Back in Mississippi, I worked from dawn to dark every day, but never for myself. Never building anything I could keep or tend with pride. This is different. This matters." They stood in comfortable silence, sipping their coffee and watching as a pair of ravens circled overhead, their calls echoing through the clearing. The settlement where they traded was a 2-hour walk to the south, a small collection of buildings inhabited by a mix of British settlers, French trappers, and native peoples who had lived on the island for generations beyond counting. The British authorities asked few questions about where people came from or what they might be running from, concerned primarily with maintaining order and collecting taxes. Haken and Amara had registered as married settlers, which was true enough. In every way that mattered, even if no formal ceremony had occurred, and had been allocated land where they could build their homestead. "A letter arrived last week," Amara said after a while. "From Gideon Frost. I picked it up when I went to the settlement for flour." She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn from having been read multiple times. "He writes that Silas Crow came to his trading post twice more after we left, asking questions, searching for any sign of where we had gone. Frost told him nothing, claimed we had never been there at all. Eventually, Crow gave up the search and returned south." Haken felt a weight he had not realized he was still carrying lift slightly from his shoulders. "He is truly gone then." "Frost believes so," Amara replied. "He writes that he heard from other traders that Harrow's plantation failed over the winter. The man apparently overextended himself financially and lost everything when a flood destroyed his cotton crop. He has returned to Mississippi in disgrace. Even if he wanted to continue searching for me, he no longer has the resources to do so." She folded the letter carefully and returned it to her pocket. "We are truly free, Haken. Not just free because we ran far enough or hid well enough, but free because the man who claimed to own me no longer has the power to enforce that claim." Haken set down his coffee cup and pulled Amara into an embrace, feeling her arms wrap around him in return. "I am glad," he said quietly. "Glad that you can finally stop looking over your shoulder, stop waiting for the moment when our peace would be shattered. You deserve this life, Amara. You deserve every moment of happiness we build here." She pulled back enough to look up at his face, her hand coming up to rest against his cheek. "We deserve it," she corrected gently. "Not just me. You have sacrificed as much as I have, given up the mountains you loved, the solitary life you had built. You did not have to choose me, did not have to leave everything behind to help a stranger. You stopped being a stranger the moment I lifted that stone off your body," Haken said. "And I did not sacrifice anything I was not ready to lose. That solitary life was not living. It was merely existing, hiding from pain rather than seeking joy. You taught me the difference." He kissed her forehead gently. "This is where I choose to be." They returned to their respective tasks as the morning wore on, Haken finishing with the wood splitting while Amara tended to the garden, pulling weeds and checking the vegetables for ripeness. They moved around each other with the practiced efficiency of partners who had learned each other's rhythms, who could communicate with a glance or a gesture as easily as with words. By midday, they had completed the necessary chores and decided to walk to the nearby stream that fed their water supply. carrying fishing lines and hooks that Haken had fashioned from bone. The stream ran clear and cold over smooth stones, home to salmon and trout that could be caught with patience and skill. Haken taught Amara the proper way to read the water, to identify the places where fish would rest behind rocks or in deeper pools, to set the line so the bait would drift naturally with the current. They caught 3 good-sized trout within an hour, enough for their dinner and breakfast the next morning. As they sat on the bank cleaning the fish, Amara spoke of something that had been on her mind for weeks. "I have been thinking about the future," she said, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she scaled the fish. "About what comes after. We are settled here, after the homestead is established, and we have proved we can survive the winters." She paused, glancing at him. "I want to help others. People like me who have escaped slavery and are trying to build new lives in British territory. I want to use our home as a way station, a place where they can rest and heal before moving on to wherever they choose to settle." Haken considered this, his expression thoughtful. "It would be dangerous," he said. "Even here, there are those who sympathize with the American South, who might report escaped slaves to authorities or bounty hunters. We could draw attention we do not want." "I know," Amara said. "But I also know what it feels like to run with nowhere safe to stop, to be injured and exhausted with no one to turn to. If you had not found me, I would have died in that canyon. How many others are out there right now, facing the same desperate circumstances?" She met his eyes. "We have the space, the resources, the knowledge of how to survive in this wilderness. We could make a difference." Haken was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You are right," he said. "We have been given much, and it would be selfish to keep it only for ourselves." He reached out and took her hand. "If this is what you want, then we will do it. But we must be careful, plan thoroughly, establish contacts who can guide people to us safely without leaving a trail that could be followed." That night, as they lay together in the loft of their cabin, listening to the wind move through the trees outside, Amara spoke into the darkness. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Leaving your mountains, binding your life to mine, giving up the freedom of solitude for the complications of partnership." Haken was silent for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "I regret nothing," he said finally. "The mountains are still there if I ever wish to visit them, but they are no longer my home. You are my home now, Amara. Wherever we are together, that is where I belong." He felt her move closer, her head resting on his shoulder. "We have built something here that neither of us could have built alone. That is worth more than any freedom that comes from isolation." As the first anniversary of their arrival on Vancouver Island approached, Haken and Amara stood together on the ridge above their cabin, looking out over the forest that had become their home. The cabin had been expanded, the garden enlarged, and the clearing now included a small barn for the goats they had acquired and the chickens that provided eggs. It was a far cry from the desperate flight through the Cascade Mountains, from the cave behind the waterfall where they had huddled together against the cold and the fear. "We have come so far," Amara said, her hand finding Haken's and squeezing gently. "Sometimes I can barely remember the person I was a year ago. So broken and hopeless that I asked you to kill me rather than let me face another day. That person still exists inside you," Haken said. "Not broken anymore, but healed. Stronger for what you endured." He turned to face her. "We both carry our pasts, Amara. The trick is not to forget them, but to use them. To let them inform who we become rather than define who we are." The sun was setting behind them, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. And as they stood together watching the light fade, they both felt the truth of what they had built. It was not just a homestead, though it was that. It was proof that even in a world marked by cruelty and injustice, kindness could still flourish, that two people who had every reason to give up on humanity could choose instead to embrace it. And in that choice, they had found not just survival but purpose, Not just freedom, but home.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.